Hey guys, so I just wanted to do a couple of examples with you on this worksheet. It's pretty straightforward. So you are going to identify the elements in each of these compounds. Then you're going to determine the bond type. So remember, it's covalent if there are two nonmetals, and then it is ionic if there is a metal and a nonmetal. And remember, metals are on the left-hand side of the table, non-metals are on the right hand, but we know that by now. We're old hats at this. So once you do that, you are going to also provide the compound name. And remember, there are different naming rules depending on if it is an ionic bond or a covalent bond. So the first one's done for you, and then I will do a couple more as well. So here we have NO2, right? Now, the first metal, or the first element, I should say, it's not a metal. The first element is nitrogen, which is a nonmetal, and that's what goes in column 1. The second element is oxygen, which is also a nonmetal, which goes in column 2. And because this is a bond between two nonmetals, we know that it's covalent, okay? So since that's a covalent bond, we go by our naming rules that we just learned in this lesson for the covalent compounds, which is nitrogen, because there's only one nitrogen. And remember, if it's the first element, it does not get a prefix, so it's nitrogen. And then there are two oxygen. 2 is di. Remember, we've got to use our prefixes, so it's nitrogen dioxide. So we drop the ending and end in IDE. Okay, and it's as simple as that. So I'm going to do a couple of examples, and then we will go from there. So I'll do this one. So here our first element is sulfur. So sulfur, which is a nonmetal. Okay. Our second element is oxygen, which is also a nonmetal. So because these two are both nonmetals, this is a covalent compound, because covalent compounds or covalent bonds occur between two nonmetals. And now we're going to name. So we have sulfur, and we have one sulfur, so he does not get that prefix. So he'll be sulfur. And then there's two oxygens, so it'll be dioxide. Okay, so there is another covalent example. The other example I wanted to do is this one right here, copper chloride, right? So this is going to be copper chloride, but we got to figure out what the charge is on the transition metal. So now this is going to be an ionic bond because copper is a metal and chlorine is a nonmetal. So let's just do that first. So copper is a metal and chlorine is a nonmetal. So we know this is ionic. Okay. Now here's where the tricky part comes in, because you guys know at this point how to get the charges for the metals in the table. However, the transition metals that are in that middle block, they're different. They can have different charges. So I'm going to show you how to work backwards to get the charge on the transition metal. And it's pretty simple because all we have to do is kind of backtrack with our swap, drop, and chop. So we know we have copper and we know we have chlorine, right? And that gives us the formula here. So we don't have to go and find the formula for this compound. Chlorine, we know, is a charge of -1. Okay, and just a brief review is because chlorine is in the halogen group, which is group 17. So he has 7 valence electrons, and he wants 1 electron to fill his octet. So he gains 1. He's got a charge of -1. Okay, all the halogens have a charge of -1. And of course, we know that in this formula, if we were to backtrack, that this little imaginary subscript here for the 1 is where that comes from, right? Because like the chlorine would be, we know that chlorine is -1, and we have copper. And when we do our swap, drop, and chop, that's where the subscript comes from, right? But we have to figure out what was the charge on the copper, because the copper is a transition metal. We can't just look at the table and figure it out. all you have to do is look at the the subscript of the chlorine, right? Because remember, this was originally the charge of the copper. So it would be 2 plus. So this would be copper chloride, right? Because it's an ionic bond. However, remember with the transition metals, we have that fancy naming system we have to do where we put the charge into Roman numerals. So with ionic bonding or ionic naming, we start with the metal first, which is copper. Because it is a transition metal, we have to put the charge in Roman numerals. So that's 2. So that's just 2 uppercase I's. And then we have our anion, which is chlorine. We drop the INE and replace it with IDE. So it's CHL. So then our name of this particular compound is copper 2 chloride. You only have to do the Roman numerals for the ionic compounds if it's a transition metal. And remember, let me pull up the periodic table really quick. And remember, your transition metals are the metals in this block right here. So from 3 to 12. So if it falls in this range, that's a transition metal. It will need a Roman numeral. If it's in group 1 or 2, it will not need, or group 13, it will not need a Roman numeral because you can just get the charge from the table. Okay, so I hope that helps with those examples. So I did 2 of them, so that means you have a few to do on your own. If you have questions or need help, let me know.